Draw a line down the map of southern Africa, from Luanda to Cape Town, and something breaks the pattern. Nearly 9 million people live at one end. Close to 5 million live at the other. Between them, almost nothing. No city, no town chain, no road that survives the whole distance. 2,000 miles of Atlantic coastline, longer than the entire Eastern Seaboard of the United States, and almost no one lives on it. You can stand at the edge of the ocean here, waves at your feet, and die of thirst before anyone finds you. This isn't a war zone. It isn't a restricted military strip. It's 2026, and this coast is still empty. The question is why? The obvious answer is desert. Deserts push people away. That's true, but it doesn't explain why this exact coastline stayed empty for 500 years while governments, companies, and empires kept trying, one after another, to break it open. Part of what kept people out came from the ocean itself. A current so cold it rewired the climate of an entire coastline. Part of it came from what was buried under the sand. Wealth so valuable that modern governments still guard empty dunes with armed patrols. And part of it is happening right now. A landscape that is still actively erasing anything built on top of it. 3 separate forces from 3 different centuries producing one result. To see how strange that result is, look at the rest of the continent first. Africa is not one climate. It's dozens stacked side by side on a landmass most people badly underestimate. The whole continent could swallow the United States, China, India, and most of Western Europe with room left over, and most world maps distort it down to a fraction of its real size. Just north of this empty coast sits the Congo Basin, the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth, dense enough that entire nations live inside its canopy without ever seeing open sky, supporting hundreds of millions of people, thousands of plant and animal species, and river systems that never fully run dry. On the opposite side of southern Africa, the eastern coast runs green and humid. Mozambique and eastern South Africa get enough rainfall to support some of the densest farmland and largest coastal population centers on the continent. Cities like Durban and Maputo, built directly on productive, well-watered shoreline. Same general latitude as the coast we're talking about tonight. Completely different worlds, separated by nothing more than which side of the continent the ocean current happens to run past. Then there's the West. Namibia occupies most of the empty stretch between Angola and South Africa. It covers more land than France and Germany combined, and holds roughly 3 million people, one of the lowest population densities of any country on Earth, well below 3 people per square kilometer on average, and the real number along the coast itself is close to 0. Almost none of them live near the ocean. Drive west from nearly any inland town, and the landscape stops making sense. Vegetation thins, then disappears. What's left is sand, not scattered patches of it, but an unbroken sea of dunes, running for hundreds of miles, some rising over 1,000 feet, falling straight into the Atlantic surf. Geologists consider it the oldest desert on the planet, dry for at least 55 million years. Older than the Sahara, older than almost anything comparable. The Sand people who lived along its inland edges for generations had a name for it. Translated, it means the land God made in anger. A separate group, the strandlopers, or beach walkers, actually lived directly on the shoreline itself for thousands of years, surviving on stranded whale carcasses, seal colonies, and shellfish, building shelter frames out of whale rib bones because there was no timber for hundreds of miles in any direction. Portuguese sailors, arriving centuries later by ship, called the northern half of it something closer to a warning, the gates of hell. That reputation isn't folklore, it's a body count. More than 1,000 shipwrecks are buried along this shoreline. The Eduard Bolin, a German cargo steamer, ran aground in fog in 1909 and now sits more than a quarter-mile inland, buried to its upper deck by dunes that simply moved the coastline around it. In 1942, A British transport ship called the Dunedin Star wrecked near the same stretch, stranding more than 100 passengers and crew on a coastline with no roads and no fresh water. The rescue took almost a month, and 3 of the rescuers died trying to reach them. Rusted hulls sit half swallowed in sand up and down this shoreline, some visible from the beach, most gone entirely under it. Whale bones and seal carcasses bleach beside them. The northern section carries a formal name on modern maps because of exactly this, the Skeleton Coast. But a nickname doesn't explain why a coastline stays empty in an age of desalination plants and climate-controlled cities rising out of deserts everywhere else on the planet. Dubai turned open sand into a skyline in under 40 years. Las Vegas built a city of 2 million people in a basin that gets 4 inches of rain a year. Humans have proven, repeatedly, that a hostile climate alone is not enough to keep a coastline empty. There's an even closer comparison on the opposite side of the same ocean current system. Chile's Atacama Desert sits on the Pacific coast of South America, fed by the Humboldt Current, the Benguela's cold water twin. Some parts of the Atacama haven't recorded measurable rainfall in recorded history. And yet the Chilean coast there isn't empty. Antofagasta, a port city of nearly 400,000 people, sits directly on that same hyper-arid shoreline, piping in water and running one of the busiest copper export terminals on the continent. If aridity alone determined where people settle, that city shouldn't exist either. So something else has to be holding the Namibian coast back, something that isn't just about rainfall. Here's where the easy explanations start falling apart. The first assumption is that it's simply too hot and dry for anyone to survive. Except the coast itself isn't hot. Average temperatures along the shoreline sit in the 60s Fahrenheit for most of the year, mild by desert standards, sometimes cooler than Cape Town on the same afternoon. Walk 50 miles inland, and the temperature swings by tens of degrees within a single day, hot enough at midday to blister exposed skin, cold enough after sunset to require a jacket. The heat is inland, deep in the dune fields. The coast is cold, foggy, and damp, which makes the second assumption even stranger. The second assumption is that there's no fresh water, so nothing can grow, so no one's settled. That's mostly true, but it doesn't explain why colonial powers who routinely built cities in places with zero fresh water, from Las Vegas to Riyadh, never bothered to pipe water in here the way they did almost everywhere else they wanted land. Portugal held ports at both ends of this coastline for 400 years and never tried, despite having the ships, the labor, and the colonial ambition to attempt it almost everywhere else on the African continent. The third assumption is the strangest one. People assume that once colonial rule ended, once South Africa, Namibia, and Angola became independent nations with full control over their own coastlines, the restrictions on this land would have lifted. New governments, the logic goes, tear down old colonial barriers. Instead, the opposite happened. When Namibia gained independence in 1990, the government didn't open the coast. It expanded the restricted zone. Guards increased, surveillance increased, prison sentences for trespassing got longer, not shorter. An independent African nation, fully in control of its own territory, chose to keep 2,000 miles of its own coastline locked. That's not what desert climates do on their own. Climate keeps people uncomfortable. It doesn't keep armed guards on a beach for a century, and it doesn't explain why a democratically elected government, answering to its own citizens for the first time in its history, chose to extend a colonial-era restriction instead of dismantling it. Something with real value has to be sitting underneath all that emptiness, and something in the physical land itself has to be actively fighting back against anyone who tries to build there permanently. Both are true. Neither is the whole story on its own. The real answer sits at the intersection of ocean chemistry, buried wealth, and a desert that refuses to hold still. Start with the ocean, because the ocean is what made the land uninhabitable in the first place. Running north along this entire coastline is the Benguela Current, a massive band of water that originates in the frigid Southern Ocean near Antarctica and flows north for thousands of miles before finally warming enough to bend back out into the open Atlantic. It carries oxygen-rich, nutrient-dense water along South Africa, Namibia, and Angola. But that water is cold, often under 60 degrees Fahrenheit, even close to the equator. In a normal coastal system, warm ocean water evaporates, rises, forms clouds, and drifts inland as rain, the same basic engine that waters nearly every populated coastline on Earth. Here the water is too cold for that cycle to start. The air sitting directly above the surface gets chilled by the current and becomes dense, and dense air behaves like a lid rather than an engine. It sits, trapped, underneath a layer of much warmer air higher in the atmosphere, in a pattern meteorologists call a temperature inversion, essentially sealing off the moisture below from ever rising high enough to condense into rain. No rising air means no evaporation cycle, which means almost no rain clouds ever form over this stretch of ocean, even though it's sitting on the edge of the second largest ocean on the planet, with more water in front of it than almost anywhere else on Earth. That's step 1, a cold current that blocks rain before it can begin. Some interior stretches of this desert go a full calendar year without a single recorded drop of rain, and multi-year stretches with essentially none are common. It's not an exaggeration to call parts of it one of the driest places on the surface of the Earth. Step 2 is what the current gives the land instead of rain: fog. When the cold sea air collides with the hot, dry desert air pushing off the dunes, it condenses into thick fog banks that roll inland and blanket the coast for more than half the year, sometimes reaching 60 miles inland before it burns off in the morning sun. That fog is the only water source for the plants and animals that live here. A darkling beetle, native to these dunes, has evolved to climb to the top of a ridge at dawn, tilt its own body at an angle, and let condensation run down its shell straight into its mouth. Namib elephants and desert-adapted lions have learned to travel unusually long distances between scattered fog-fed vegetation patches, sometimes 40 miles between drinks, because nothing closer holds water. But for the ships that used to run this coastline, that same fog was lethal, hiding sandbanks and rocky shoals until it was too late to turn. Radar didn't exist for most of the centuries. Ships tried to pass through here, and even after it did, the shifting sandbanks moved faster than the charts could be updated. The fog didn't just fail to help human settlement. For centuries, it actively killed the people who tried to pass through. Step 3 is what was buried in the sand the whole time, waiting to be found. In 1908, a railway worker named Zacharias Luala was clearing sand off the tracks near the coastal town of Luderitz when he noticed something catching the light. It was a diamond. Then another. The Benguela Current and the Orange River had spent millions of years grinding diamonds out of inland deposits, tumbling them along the riverbed until the rough edges wore smooth, and depositing them directly onto these beaches and dune fields. Luala reported the find to a German railway foreman named August Stauch, who quietly bought up mineral rights across the surrounding desert before word got out. Within a year, Stauch claims had made him one of the wealthiest men in the German colonial empire, and the German colonial administration in Berlin, which had claimed this territory in 1884, immediately understood what it was sitting on. In 1908, they declared a stretch of coastline roughly the size of Switzerland, the Sperrgebiet, the Forbidden Zone, and shut it to the public entirely. A private company called the Consolidated Diamond Mines of Southwest Africa took over the concession soon after, and for decades, simply walking onto that sand without a permit was treated as trespassing on a company's private property, backed by the full force of a colonial government. Step 4 is why that Forbidden Zone never reopened, even after Germany lost the territory, even after apartheid-era South Africa took over administration, even after full independence in 1990. Diamonds don't expire. When Namibia became a sovereign nation, its government didn't dismantle the old colonial mining district. It formalized a 50-50 joint venture with the De Beers Diamond Cartel, a company called Namdeb, and kept the Sperrgebiet locked, now with modern surveillance instead of colonial-era patrols. Workers who mine there today still go through daily X-rays before they're allowed to leave to make sure no one is smuggling a rough diamond out in their body. Offshore, specialized ships now drag crawler vehicles across the seabed itself, vacuuming up diamond-bearing gravel from depths the Benguela Current spent millions of years depositing, extending the restricted zone out past the beach and into the ocean. A century after the first stone was found in the sand, the same stretch of coast is still sealed for the same reason, and diamonds remain one of the largest single contributors to Namibia's entire national economy. What actually happens if you try to walk into the Sperrgebiet today isn't ambiguous. Namdeb and the Namibian government run joint patrols along the fence line, backed by aerial surveillance and, in recent years, drones. Unauthorized entry is a criminal offense under Namibian law, and mine security has the legal authority to detain anyone found inside the boundary until police arrive. A handful of amateur prospectors and photographers get caught every year trying to slip past the fencing, drawn by stories of diamonds still visible on the surface, in places even security patrols haven't fully swept. Almost none of them find anything worth the risk. The zone is simply too well controlled and has been for more than a century, first by a colonial army, then by an apartheid government, now by a joint state corporate security operation that answers to both a national government and a multinational diamond company at the same time. And underneath all of that, there's a fourth force that has nothing to do with money or politics at all. The dunes themselves refuse to stay put. Coastal winds push sand inland at rates of up to 50 feet a year, which sounds small until you realize what it does to anything built in its path. A road here doesn't erode slowly over decades. It gets buried within months of the maintenance crews leaving. Namibia's own transport authority has tried, more than once, to keep short sections of coastal track clear with regular grading, and even those short sections require near-constant maintenance to stay passable. Extend that same fight across 2,000 miles of shoreline, and the cost stops being a budget line and starts being a permanent, unwinnable commitment. Even if every government along this coast wanted to build a highway connecting Cape Town to Luanda tomorrow, physics alone would make it a losing fight, the same way it would be a losing fight to permanently pave over a river that never stops moving. Namibia's history is full of people who tried to fight that physics and lost. Portuguese navigators Diogo Cao and Bartolomeu Dias sailed this coast in the late 1400s, searching for a route to India, and both recorded the same verdict: nothing worth stopping for. Dias planted a stone cross at the southern tip of this desert in 1488 to mark Portugal's claim, and that cross is still standing today, one of the only permanent structures anyone bothered to build along this stretch for the next 4 centuries. No fresh water, no timber, no visible wealth, just endless sand and fog. So Portugal built its ports far to the north, in what's now Angola, where rivers actually reached the sea. The Dutch and British did the same to the south, founding Cape Town in a Mediterranean climate, hundreds of miles from the desert's edge. For nearly 400 years, the middle of the coastline simply wasn't worth a European power's time. That changed in the 1880s, when European colonial powers were dividing the entire continent among themselves at conferences in Berlin, and Germany needed a claim of its own to compete with Britain and France. In 1884, Germany took the leftover stretch between British-controlled South Africa and Portuguese Angola and named it German Southwest Africa. For over 2 decades, colonial administrators considered it close to worthless, a barren strip separating 2 more valuable territories, and Berlin nearly abandoned the colony outright more than once. Then Luala found his diamond in 1908, and everything about that assessment reversed within a matter of months. The German colonial government spent the next 6 years building an entire mining infrastructure in the middle of the desert. The town of Kolmanskop rose almost overnight, complete with a hospital, a bowling alley, a ballroom, and one of the first X-ray machines on the African continent, brought in specifically to screen mine workers for stolen diamonds. At its peak, Kolmanskop was producing close to a tenth of the entire world's diamond supply from a town built on sand that, decades earlier, no one had wanted at any price. World War I ended German rule here within a decade. South African forces, acting on behalf of the British Empire, invaded and captured the territory in 1915, and South Africa would go on to administer it for the next 75 years under a League of Nations mandate, and later the United Nations, folding it into the machinery of apartheid while keeping the Diamond Zone locked under the same restrictions the Germans had written. Black Namibians were confined under apartheid-era pass laws to designated homelands far from both the mining district and the coast itself, which meant the two groups of people who might otherwise have had the strongest claim to this land, the descendants of the strandlopers and the local workforce administering the mines, were both kept furthest from the shoreline by law. Angola to the north fought a war of independence against Portugal that didn't end until 1975, and the fighting there continued in a civil war for almost 3 more decades, one of the longest and deadliest conflicts on the continent in the 20th century. Namibia didn't achieve independence from South Africa until 1990, following its own armed liberation struggle that had run for more than 2 decades. 3 different colonial exits, 3 different timelines, 3 different wars, and in every case, the same stretch of empty coastline in the middle stayed exactly as closed as it had been under the previous government. Kolmanskop is still there. It's just not a town anymore. The mines ran dry in the 1950s, and the desert did what deserts here always do. Sand filled the ballroom, drift by drift, until it reached the ceiling in some rooms and buried the lower shelves of the hospital's medicine cabinets. Dunes now run straight through doorways and climb halfway up interior walls, lit at midday by sunlight pouring through windows that no longer have glass in them. Nobody rebuilt it, because rebuilding it would mean fighting the same 50 feet a year sand migration that made it impossible to maintain in the first place. It sits abandoned less than 10 miles from a mining operation that is still right now actively pulling diamonds out of the same coastline. A functioning company town and a dead one, separated by 10 miles of the exact same sand. So the coast stayed empty, and it stayed empty for reasons that layered on top of each other instead of replacing each other. First, the ocean made it too dry and too foggy to settle safely. Then a discovery in the sand turned a section of it into one of the most heavily guarded strips of private land on the continent. Then the physical geography made permanent infrastructure almost impossible to maintain even where it wasn't restricted. And by the time all 3 of those forces had run their course, something unexpected had happened to the land itself. With no roads, no towns, and no agriculture ever established, the coastline stayed almost entirely undeveloped by default. Today, the governments of South Africa, Namibia, and Angola have converted nearly the entire stretch into a continuous chain of national parks. South Africa's Richtersveld, Namibia's Namib-Naukluft and Skeleton Coast Parks, and Angola's Iona National Park at the northern end. Together, they form one of the longest unbroken protected coastlines on the planet, longer than the combined length of every national park shoreline in the continental United States. Desert-adapted elephants and lions move through terrain that would kill an unprepared human in a day, following fog-line vegetation corridors their ancestors mapped out over thousands of years. Cape fur seal colonies stretch for miles along beaches that have never held a permanent building, some numbering well over 100,000 animals in a single stretch of sand. None of it was designed as conservation from the start. It was accidental, a side effect of exclusion that began with a cold ocean current and ended generations later with a diamond monopoly and a desert that never stopped moving. A small tourism industry has learned to work within those same restrictions instead of fighting them. A handful of fly-in safari camps operate under strict government concessions along the Skeleton Coast National Park, flying guests in on small charter planes because there are still no reliable roads to drive them in on. Nightly rates at some of these camps run into the thousands of dollars, not because the accommodations are extravagant, but because the entire operation has to be flown in, generator-powered, and kept small enough that it leaves the surrounding dunes essentially untouched once the season ends. It's the closest anyone has come to a permanent human foothold on this coast in 500 years, and even that foothold is deliberately temporary, built to be small enough that the desert barely notices it's there. So back to the map. 9 million people in Luanda, 5 million in Cape Town. Between them, 2,000 miles that never filled in. Not because no one wanted the land, but because three unrelated forces, spanning millions of years, a century of colonial history, and a supply chain of rough diamonds, all happened to agree on the same outcome without ever coordinating with each other. The ocean made the rain impossible before a single European ship ever reached this coast. The ground made the wealth undeniable the moment a railway worker looked down at the right patch of sand in 1908. And the physical land itself made permanence impossible for anyone who tried to ignore the first two, burying a casino under dunes and a shipwreck under an entire beach within a single human lifetime. Every other empty stretch of coastline on Earth has a single reason behind it: war, poverty, isolation, politics. Somalia's coast, emptied out from conflict. Parts of the Arctic, emptied out from cold alone. This one has all three of its causes running at the same time, in the same place, for completely unrelated reasons, and none of them required the others to keep working. Remove the diamonds and the fog still kills sailors. Remove the fog and the dunes still bury roads. Remove the moving sand and armed guards still stand between the public and 100 years of buried gemstones. Any one of these three forces, acting alone, might eventually have been engineered around. Dubai proved that. Antofagasta proved that. All three, compounding on top of each other for 5 centuries, is what actually kept 9 million people from ever meeting 5 million people along a single stretch of coastline in the 21st century. Cape Town keeps growing south of this coast. Luanda keeps growing north of it. Satellite images from the last 20 years show both cities expanding outward, year after year. New suburbs, new port infrastructure, new highways radiating out from each center. Neither expansion ever bends toward the middle. And the middle of the map stays exactly as blank as it was 500 years ago, guarded now by fences, patrols, and national park boundaries instead of fog and shipwrecks, but guarded all the same by a coastline that was never really empty. It was just never going to let anyone stay. If you want to see what happens when a country tries to build directly on top of geography like this, instead of around it, the story of France's tidal causeway is next. Subscribe if you want it when it goes up.